What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Heck versus Hell, where the truth we tell. Yes, you know who it is. Hello, welcome. How is it going? How is it hanging? What is the situation in your life right now, and what can we do to make it better? Thank you for tuning in this week's episode or if you're listening to this on binge listening, it's me again. How's it going? But I'm glad to be back on here, especially continuing on the journey, continuing on everything that we have. And after a long day of doing certain things, I'm ready. I'm ready to get back on here and spread some of the glorious wisdom that God has bestowed me with. Of course, everybody has their points of revelation, so we want to hear yours too. And we also will be opening those doors as well to the Truth Seekers Mastermind Alliance. So some of you could come on there. We could have these types of conversations and ask some crazy questions that people don't want to preach in their churches. You know, get into those topics that are seldom spoken about, right? If you've heard the Truth Seekers Mastermind Alliance, you know what I'm talking about. If you heard the hidden episodes, you know what I'm talking about. And then speaking of which, I'm actually going to record another hidden episode very soon about the depth of getting what you ask for. Now, I may have already mentioned this a little bit. I just can't remember what episode. This is why sometimes it's a little difficult whenever I have the titles the way I have them, because I can't remember what episode I put this in, but I was basically giving my testimony as to my cases and charges that I had against me. If you've been following out throughout the journey, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, well, stay tuned, and I'll go much more in depth with that as well. That might be like an hour-long segment, just that straight testimony right there, and what led up to it, as well as how it turned out and the process throughout it, and what ultimately, I mean, that was one of the biggest things that even prompted me to begin this journey of Heck versus Hell. So yeah, it's gonna be a longer one than we're used to, because even this one's not too crazy long, but it's filled with knowledge, and that's what we're here for. Knowledge, right? Revelation, sharing experiences, and growing in faith. So that being said, we are here, we are happy, we are blessed by the best. So let's get into it. I honestly have no idea where this conversation is going on the way, but I do want to speak about something that, as you found out from the title, maybe suggested it or came to an understanding or an epiphany by yourself. But it was a line that I wrote, kind of a revelational point that I came to understand that I've spoken about previously. You know, and it's a huge portion as to our walk with God, which is very important, right? One of my favorite scriptures, it's in Matthew 18, I believe. Is it 3:18 or 18:3? I can't remember. I want to say it's Matthew 18, verse 3. But it's essentially where Christ is talking about how we have to be like these little ones. It says, truly I tell you, if you do not become like these little ones, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Right? I believe it is chapter 18, verse 3. And it shows how we have to have the process and thought form and loyalty and trust, yet also the inner innocence in God as we were intended to have. Because if you think about it, whenever we go all the way back to Adam and Eve, and this is where it really came from. Well, to give you what I am going to say, let me give you the actual quote that I wrote down. I put, when God allowed Satan to have a kingdom, ignorance was no longer an option. Meaning, once Adam and Eve bit from the tree of knowledge, it became imperative that knowledge is a part of us. And it's incredibly deep. And we actually had a conversation, I want to say on last week's episode or the previous episode before this, if you're listening to this later down the line, about the gardens of your heart, about the trees and its fruits. And we had little snippets about the Garden of Eve, which I think were phenomenal in how God allowed that to be said. However, this is a different aspect. This is a different looking of it. And it really makes you think about how life was already a part of us. Some of the trees, and that's so weird because obviously we understand, right? We understand that life is a part of us, that life was always meant to be there. We were living in the presence of God. Life was, it was there, you know, it wasn't not there. It was already a part of us. Yet knowledge wasn't. So was in one way the tree placed there, right? Because there was two trees that were mentioned. It said, you may not eat from the tree of knowledge, right? That's the tree that was focused on. That was the tree that was mainly put on there. So that means that they had the capabilities of eating from the tree of life before they actually ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Meaning that was a no-brainer. That was a byproduct of living in the Garden of Eden. However, ignorance was a structure that God wanted us to have, and not ignorance in the sense of just being stupid or staying dumb, but in the knowledge of being faithful, being like children. We were meant to be God's children, and He wanted us to be so, to live in a place just so heavenly and phenomenal, right? Because we think about it too. We look at children and we say, golly, how it is to be a child. The imagination that they have, the creativity that they have, it is so beautiful. And they live in a sense of bliss because they don't know how hard the world is yet. Some do. Some have experienced it. But those that still have their childhood intact, they don't know what it's like. They don't have that harsh experience that we've experienced living on this earth. You know, and some of you have already experienced that heavily. And some of you may have experienced it very, very early on. Yet, it is something so beautiful. And I think I've mentioned that before about how ignorance is bliss, but it's not the point of ignorance being bliss. It's the point of how having no knowledge of good and evil doesn't make it a sin. Not to say we can go and do whatever we want, but it is outside of a thought. It's something that isn't even a part of us, so it can't come into fruition. It's something that we can't even think about or comprehend, meaning it can't come to fruition. You know, obviously we have a certain sense of knowledge and we're meant to grow, but I mean, really think about it that way, because a child like that, that's just playing around in their creativity and their love and how they were created to be, isn't going to go and go like, oh, how fun would it be to go and grab this and stab somebody, right? They might be a little curious of thinking, you know what does this do? And maybe poke themselves and realize, oh, that hurts. Anyways, let's go somewhere else. You know, it doesn't fully manifest into a seed of evil. Not only that, but it allows us to have the lack of knowledge of knowing what we're doing. So to an extent, it was very vital for God to create that situation and circumstance to where we were able to sin so we could understand the moral code of God and appreciate where we truly were and where we are meant to be, where we are meant to reside and dwell in, right? In the presence of God. And who we are, what we are. It gives us that appreciation factor because, I mean, God had everything they could have wanted. He placed them in the position right there in the center to where they could have everything they could have wanted except for that one thing. What else could they need? They had no understanding of what else they could need. Some people are like, oh, well, he has everything, but he didn't have that one thing, so it puts the focal point on that one thing. And yes, absolutely it does, but it also takes away the focal point of what you can be grateful for. So that being said, we were meant to be ignorant, right? We were meant to be like children, not having that kind of knowledge, because even right as soon as they ate it, they were like, oh, we're naked. We're not supposed to be naked. Why are we naked? But it's not a dirty thought form. It's not a corrupted thought form of seeing nakedness whenever you see other people naked, right? If you put babies in a room and they're all naked, they're not going to know what's going on. They're not going to have corrupt thoughts of thinking, oh, wow, that's a penis. Oh, that's crazy. Look at that. No, they're looking at other babies and like, what's going on? How you doing? What's up with you? You know, it's such a different thought pattern and thought form that goes on when you don't have evil in place. Now, the paradoxical, interesting aspect of this, though, and this is why I said I don't completely know where I'm going, but I did want to put it on your mind to think about, to understand that we need to never stop growing. We need to be to a point where we're always elevating and always seeking more knowledge to get closer to God and get closer to the understanding of fulfilling and uncovering the greatness within us so we can fulfill our purpose of this world and align with that will of God, right? That's where knowledge is imperative for our mission and our purpose. However, it's paradoxical because we were meant to be ignorant, yet knowledge is a piece of God. And that's where it gets really interesting in that manner, because even in Hosea 4:6, right, it says, my people perish because of ignorance. My people perish because of lack of knowledge, right? And it is through certain things that we don't have knowledge. And we could perish in financially, right? If we have that lack of knowledge, of that lack of financial literacy to understand how money works and how money operates. We could have perishing in our relationship because we don't understand how the other person works. We don't understand how a relationship is supposed to operate. We don't understand the needs and desires of a woman or a man, of our partner, of our spouse. We don't understand how to communicate effectively in order to accomplish the goal of staying together, right? So we perish in the relationship, in the marriage, in the unity. There's so many places where lacking knowledge allows you to perish, right? This isn't Forrest Gump. This isn't one of those situations where you just blindly walk and everything works itself out. Yes, there are things and walks in life, certain avenues in life where faith will take us there. And we can follow a little bit blindly, yet understanding and knowing that God is God and God is just. God is all powerful and almighty, and he will do what is best for his children, for even an evil man knows not to give a rock to his son that asks for bread. So how much more will your Father do unto you? Knowing that, right? It's not a blind follow, it's a trust follow. And it's so much difference than someone just going around the world, letting life happen to them all completely, and having these aspects and avenues where things just fall into place and call, as we know, quote unquote, lucky, even though we understand that luck doesn't exist, right? They'll have maybe one or two certain situations, but even whenever it comes to people having that stroke of quote unquote luck and becoming millionaires overnight because they hit the lottery and now they have incredible amounts of money, yet later down the line, not even I think 7 years, the statistic, like 95% of lottery winners, I think it's more than that. It might be like 98% of lottery winners become broke again after 7 years. Now, the numbers may be wrong there, but the point is they go back to being broke, meaning they cannot financially, keep that wealth, right? And that's also biblical. An inheritance gained fast will not last very long. That's not exactly word for word what it is, but that's along the lines. However, it's something that is really vital in this walk of life. It's a part of God, and it's applied knowledge that gets us even closer to God, because that's whenever it becomes wisdom. Wisdom is the application of knowledge. And it's so paradoxical in that manner, because we understand that God is wisdom. God is definitely wisdom. That is an attribute of God. That is something that comes from God, right? Because even the devils aren't wise, because they're still trying to go and work against God, knowing where they're ending up. That's not wise. They're not wise, yet they have knowledge. See, and that's where it gets so complicated, because we were meant to not have knowledge, not have wisdom, yet God is wisdom. But regardless of fact, it could have all been set up strategically in that mannerism of understanding that wisdom is an element that we must have, and that unlocks our true divine self. Because I feel as though Adam had a higher purpose than tending to the world. Although that is amazing, naming all the animals, right? Being there through the garden and looking over it, that's phenomenal. I think he had a much higher purpose than tending the world and being fruitful and multiplying. I don't believe that was his divine, ultimate, greatest self-purpose, although he did what was needed to be done to put God's plan in action. If the roles were swapped and he lived in a moment in time later, after the fact of the first man, I believe he had something else that could have been greater, quote unquote, because the missing piece was wisdom. Now, I'm going to be completely honest. I have nowhere else to go with this conversation, but I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to leave you with that, and how important wisdom really is. How King Solomon asked for wisdom and became easily the most powerful man in the world at his time, to where he had other people that were in really high powers going and sending their people to give stuff to him just because of the wisdom and knowledge that he had. That's how powerful wisdom is. Although, okay, that's another conversation. We're gonna go off of that. There was a portion in the Bible. I can't remember what it is. I don't know if it was Chronicles or Kings, but there was an old man that gave certain wisdom to one of these cities, and basically they forgot him because he was homeless, because he was a poor man. Yet he gave them wisdom to defend themselves. And he created a crazy, great strategy plan of war. Yet his wisdom was dismissed because of the position. Okay? So whenever you hear people preach prosperity gospel or preach positions of getting to the point of where we need to be, it is vital. It is vital to the mission and purpose. The impact in this day and age is much different than it was in the time of the disciples. Regardless, they still had to go and reach these people on foot, reach these people and have them come to them, right? Even Christ had to go and travel. Yet now that is not very cheap. It can still be done. It is not very cheap, but also setting the platform and the stage to allow it to be done, to allow your voice to be heard, to be able to set up the plan and do as the apostles and disciples were trying to do, to where widows can be taken care of, to where there are certain sections and groups where you can do this. It all comes from finding and setting up systems in this world, and that is a point of wisdom. So Christ fulfilled his purpose, and as did the disciples, but they understood too, going and selling everything they had, they needed some kind of financial situation there. But that's not the point of the conversation. The point of the conversation is wisdom. And on that note, I love you all. I hope you have a blessed one. Stay wise, stay blessed. And as always, we will catch you on the flip side. Love you guys.